This video is inspired by real events. Certain scenes and details have been altered or dramatized for storytelling purposes. My name isn't truly Sultana, but for both your safety and mine, that is the only name I will share. What I'm about to reveal is dangerous. It could cost lives, my own included. I was born into a world of luxury and cruelty, of hushed whispers and muffled cries behind the weighty doors of a palace. I am a woman of royal lineage, raised in one of Saudi Arabia's most influential families. From the moment I entered the world, I was swaddled in silk but shackled by invisible chains. When most people hear the word princess, they think of fairy tales, sparkling gowns, freedom, adoration, an easy life. But in my reality, that title carried a far darker meaning. It was a cage decorated in jewels, where I was forced to smile, even as my spirit bled quietly behind a veil that was never my choice. I grew up in a palace with marble floors that turned my bare feet cold. In rooms so vast my cries echoed back at me, with servants who drifted by like ghosts. The chandeliers shone like stars, but shadows always clung to the corners. My childhood was full of contradictions. Extravagant breakfasts in gilded bowls, but never a gentle word from the men at the table. I was just a child, yet reminded every day that I was only a girl. My father was a formidable man, solemn and unbending, admired by many. To outsiders, he was generous and noble. To us, he was the ultimate authority. No one dared defy him, least of all his daughters. He had 12 wives and dozens of children, but he never showed affection to any of us. He thought women existed only to obey, to serve, to remain out of sight unless called. He believed himself merciful simply for letting us live under his roof. When I was 8, I received my first harsh lesson about my place. My older brother, Ali, only a year older, sat on a cushion in our family room as a servant offered him a tray of fresh dates. I reached for one, my fingers hovering over the fruit, when I felt a sudden sting on my hand. My father had slapped it away. He didn't say much, only, "Wait, he's a boy. You're a girl." That moment taught me what it meant to be born in the wrong body in my world. It was a lesson repeated again and again, through bruises, silence, and being exiled from the life I dared to dream about. I remember standing beside Ali, watching him ride horses in the open while I was kept indoors. I envied his freedom. I envied his laughter. I envied the fact that no one told him to lower his gaze or hide his thoughts. But even as a child, I refused to accept this was all there was. I asked dangerous questions. I asked my mother why men could strike women, but women couldn't even speak up. Why my dreams of studying abroad were dismissed as foolish. Why girls were traded like livestock to old men who paid in gifts. My mother would hush me, fear shining in her eyes. "Sultana, don't ask those things." But I kept asking. As I entered adolescence, the walls closed in tighter. My body changed, and so did the way people treated me. I was no longer a child. I was now considered a threat to my family's honor. I was veiled, hidden, and the men who once smiled at me would no longer meet my eyes. I was told not to speak unless spoken to, that laughter was improper, that silence was a woman's greatest virtue. I was constantly watched. I couldn't leave the house alone, talk on the phone without someone listening in, or attend school unless it was an all-girls institution approved by my father's male relatives. And even there, we were taught obedience more than knowledge. Then came the marriage proposal. I was 16. He was nearly 40. I'd never met him. He was wealthy, well-connected, a friend of my father's. I was told to feel honored he even wanted me. But I didn't feel honored. I felt sold. I cried in secret behind my locked bedroom door. But I couldn't lock it from the inside. My pleas to my father were ignored. My brothers laughed at me. My mother remained silent. That night, I made myself a promise. I would never stay quiet again. I began to write everything down. Every insult, every rule, every moment I was treated as lesser. I hid my writings under my bed, beneath floorboards, even inside the hollow of a broken vase. I wrote in secret, remembering everything. I told myself that one day, somehow, the world would know what happened behind those palace gates. Years later, I met Jean Sasson, an American woman willing to hear me out. She vowed to protect my identity and share my story with the world without ever using my real name. That's why you know me only as Sultana. Revealing more would be my death warrant. But keeping my name secret doesn't hide the truth. Everything I tell you is real. Every stifled scream behind heavy walls. Every girl crushed under a system that prizes control over compassion. There are countless women like me, voiceless, invisible, buried under tradition. I'm not special. I'm simply someone who found a way to speak. This isn't only my story. It's for all of us who've been silenced. And this is only the beginning. If I close my eyes, I can still see the blood. It stained the marble like a scream that wouldn't wash away. That day I learned that in my world, being a woman didn't mean grace or dignity or strength. It meant danger. It meant survival. I was 15 when my sister Nadia vanished from our home for the first time. The day she disappeared, no one said a word about it. Silence replaced her name. Within hours, her room was emptied. Her belongings taken away, as if she'd never existed. But I remembered. I remembered how her eyes would dart toward the gates whenever they creaked open. How she'd sigh when she thought no one heard, like the walls were pressing in on her too. Nadia was fearless, too fearless, she once told me in a shaking voice, not from fear of punishment, but from dread of what they'd do to us if her thoughts were discovered. Sultana, if I could run and never come back, I would. She fell in love. Not with a prince or a chosen suitor, but with a man who lived beyond our strict rules. He didn't wear gold rings or command women like servants. He was kind. He listened. He spoke to her as if she were human. That kindness became her death sentence. My family found out about them. Letter exchanged in secret. Glances across forbidden spaces. I never knew who betrayed her. A servant, maybe, or one of our brothers who followed her steps. But once they learned the truth, there was no forgiveness. My father didn't react at first. He just went to his office. That night, I heard my mother scream into her pillows, sobbing Nadia's name. But by morning, silence returned like a grave. 3 days later, Nadia was brought back. She'd been hiding at a family friend's house, begging them to protect her from what she knew awaited her. But in our world, there's no refuge, not even for princesses, especially not for them. I remember standing in the hall when I heard her voice, weak, trembling, pleading. Please, I didn't do anything. But in our society, a woman doesn't need to commit a crime to be punished. A rumor is enough. A whisper is enough. Even a glance can doom her. That night, my father called for a family council. All the men gathered. Uncles, brothers, cousins. The women were locked in their rooms. I listened through the vents. I heard words like shame, honor, purification. My heart went cold. When the doors opened, my brother Ali stepped out. His hands were clean. His expression calm, like he'd just finished dinner. Nadia never left that room alive. They claimed she died of illness. Told outsiders her heart had given out. But I knew, we all knew. Even my mother, who wore black for months, pretending it was for a dead aunt. Lies were woven into every corner of our lives. But the blood on the floor that night told the truth. No lie could hide. For weeks I couldn't sleep. I'd wake, gasping, feeling her hand in mine, hearing her voice whisper, "Run, Sultana! Get out before they destroy you too!" From then on, my fear changed shape. It wasn't just for myself anymore. It was for every girl I knew. My cousins, my classmates, the young faces in the marketplace who already had old eyes. I realized my world didn't just silence women. It erased them, but I also discovered something else. My voice, even small, was a weapon. The words I hid in secret were dangerous to them, because a woman who remembers can tell. I began writing about Nadia, not only her death, but her life. Her laughter, her defiance, how she'd tug off her veil the moment no one watched. The books she snuck into our room, the music she loved, the way she'd spin in private, dancing as if she were free. I wrote until my fingers ached, then wrote more. I promised myself that even if the world forgot her, I wouldn't. Her story would survive, even if I had to carry it in hiding forever. One night I faced my reflection and said aloud, "You will not die in silence." I wasn't a child anymore. I wasn't waiting to be saved. I was becoming the woman who would tell the stories everyone else was too afraid to speak. This you're reading now? It is the start of that vow. Nadia's blood didn't just stain our marble floor. It stained my heart. And with that mark came a purpose no one could wash away. Books were supposed to be harmless. They sat quietly on shelves, wrapped in leather or paper, full of words without weapons. But in my world, even a single page could be rebellion. A single sentence could be defiance. A girl holding a book was seen as a threat. The first forbidden book I ever read didn't come from my family or school. It was given to me by my cousin Fatima. Fatima had once studied in Cairo, before she was dragged back and forced to marry a man twice her age. She moved like someone who had known freedom and lost it. Her eyes were weary, but her mind sharp. She recognized something in me, a version of herself who hadn't yet given up. One quiet afternoon, while the men were away hunting, and the house was uncommonly silent, Fatima pressed a battered book into my hands. It had no title on the cover. Its pages were creased and marked with fingerprints from countless readings. "Don't read it here," she warned, "and don't let anyone see you." I didn't ask why. I hid it under my mattress and waited for night. When the house slept, I turned its pages with trembling fingers, afraid they might scream. It was a memoir by an Iranian woman, a doctor who fled her country after years of fighting for women's rights. Her story wasn't identical to mine in detail, but in spirit it was. She wrote about forced marriages, silenced girls, dreams crushed by male pride. She wrote about escaping, about burning, about rising again. I devoured that book like it was food, like it was air. It didn't tell me anything I hadn't felt, but it confirmed something I had never dared say out loud. We weren't free. Not just me, not just the women in my family, but millions, generations. I began to gather stories wherever I could. I found ways to sneak into the palace library, an enormous echoing room filled with ancient volumes locked behind glass. Only certain men were supposed to have the keys. But one of the guards, a kind man named Hassan, pitied me. I told him I was writing an essay for school and needed references. He let me in for an hour each week. I chose the most obscure titles I could find, careful not to pick anything too radical, too suspicious. But in those pages, buried in footnotes and foreign languages, I found slivers of truth. Gaps in the wall of lies that hemmed us in. The more I read, the more dangerous I became. Because now I had context. I could see how they built our prison. Not with metal bars, but with beliefs. With twisted interpretations. With fear masquerading as virtue. I realized something important. They feared us more than anything. Not because we were weak, but because they had worked so hard to keep us that way. One day, my brother Jamal found a book in my room. It wasn't even controversial, a French novel translated into Arabic. But the cover showed a woman without a veil. He stormed into the living room, waving it at my father. "She's getting ideas," he spat. My father narrowed his eyes at me, measuring my defiance. "Where did you get this?" "I borrowed it from school," I lied. "You will not read anything without my permission," he decreed. I nodded obediently. But that night, I read 2 more chapters under my blanket, by the glow of a tiny flashlight. My heart raced. I felt like a thief, stealing back my own mind. But I knew the price of being discovered. I'd seen what happened to Nadia. I'd heard rumors of other girls. One girl I knew, Rania, wrote a short poem comparing women to the wind. Just that. But someone reported her for mocking tradition. Her father locked her in a basement for months. When she returned to school, she no longer spoke. Not even to herself, so I learned to be careful. I memorized what I read. I burned pages I couldn't hide. I scribbled coded thoughts in the margins of schoolbooks with lemon juice as invisible ink. My mind became a hidden garden, untouched by their rules, unbroken by their fear. And still I played the part. I smiled when spoken to. I lowered my eyes. I behaved like the good daughter, because I learned survival sometimes meant wearing a mask. Not forever, but long enough to grow strong behind it. Fatima once told me, one day they'll hear our stories and refuse to believe them. They'll say we exaggerated, misunderstood, that it couldn't have been so cruel. I promised her I'd make sure they didn't forget. What you're reading now isn't just my memoir. It's resistance. It's survival written down. And if you're reading it, they failed to silence me completely. Books gave me that power. Not weapons, not rage, but words. In my world, words were the most dangerous thing a woman could wield. They called me lucky. That phrase was a chain disguised as a gift. They said I should be grateful I wasn't being married off to a stranger in some remote village. Grateful I wasn't given to a cousin with a cruel streak or a man with multiple wives. No, they said I was lucky. My husband-to-be was modern, educated, lived abroad, drove a European car. But they didn't say I wouldn't be asked. They didn't say I wouldn't even see his face until the day I was handed over like a parcel. They didn't mention my opinion, and fear counted less than the gold sewn into my wedding gown. They never said love had nothing to do with it. I was 17 when my father walked in one evening with the announcement, "You're getting married next month." Like he was telling me the weather. My mother didn't look me in the eye. She just began planning. It was a machine, a rhythm. Relatives arrived. Fabrics were measured. Music was rehearsed. A celebration built on top of my silence. I sat in the middle of it all, invisible. They used the word lavish over and over. Guests came from Riyadh and Jeddah. The hall was booked. Caterers chosen. I was measured for 7 gowns, one for each night of the pre-wedding festivities. But I felt like a ghost at my own funeral. In our culture, weddings weren't about love. They were transactions, alliances, strategies. My worth had been weighed. My virginity was a bargaining chip. My obedience was the dowry. My silence tied it all together like a ribbon. The night before the ceremony, I stood in front of a mirror. My hair heavy with oil and perfume, dressed in gold and silk. I didn't recognize myself. I looked like a princess or a doll. Anything but the girl screaming inside. My cousin Layla slipped into the room. She was 2 years older, already divorced, and she whispered like her voice could crack the walls. "You don't have to do this," she said. I turned to her. "What choice do I have?" She took my hand. "Run tonight, I'll help you." But I couldn't. Not because I didn't want to escape, I did. Not only because I feared punishment, though I did, but because I knew what it would do to my mother, my sisters. My defiance wouldn't just stain me, it would curse our family name. One sandal, one runaway bride, and my younger sisters would never marry. My father's honor would be destroyed. So I stayed, not out of love, not out of loyalty, but out of guilt. The wedding went ahead as planned. I was veiled, powdered, adorned like a prized possession. People danced around me while I sat rigid, a porcelain doll on a golden chair. I heard music, but it sounded like a funeral march. My groom, Kareem, stood beside me. Tall, handsome, cold. He barely spoke, just nodded at the right moments, as if sealing a business deal rather than joining 2 lives. When we were finally alone in the bridal suite of a grand hotel, he lifted my veil without tenderness. He didn't ask if I was frightened. He didn't wonder if I wanted to be there. To him, I was simply his. Purchased. Delivered. "Don't worry," he said, his voice flat. "I'll treat you well. As long as you obey." I didn't cry until he fell asleep. Even then, I made no sound, because I had learned that in my world, silence was a woman's armor. You wore it, or you died from exposure. The next morning, I woke up changed. My name was the same, but my rights were gone. I was now under Kareem's authority, in law, in spirit, in every way that mattered. If I wanted to travel, I needed his permission. If I wanted to work, he could forbid it. If I wished to speak among men, I had to lower my voice. I wasn't a girl anymore. I was property, decorated, owned. The irony is that Kareem didn't beat me. He wasn't violent in the way people expect when they hear stories like mine. But he never really saw me. He didn't ask what I liked, what I dreamed about, what I feared. He gave me money and demanded obedience. He offered me status and expected silence. I lived in a lavish house with high walls and windows that looked out on emptiness. That was my real prison, not the palace of my childhood with its guarded gates, but this gilded cage with luxury walls and a husband who thought affection was a weakness. I began to write again. Not letters or diary entries, but confessions. Thoughts I'd swallowed for 17 years. I wrote on napkins, receipts, in the margins of newspapers. I wrote in the dark, then burned the pages before dawn, because the one freedom they couldn't take yet was the freedom in my mind. I didn't know then, but those scraps would become this very story. These chapters. My voice. Because I refused to remain silent forever. Because my story wasn't only mine. Because even weddings in my world could be crimes disguised as celebrations. There is a room in every grand house no one talks about. It isn't shown on floor plans. It has no windows, no laughter, no chandeliers. Yet it exists in every royal home. It's the room of secrets, the place where women cry quietly, where truths are buried like corpses, where reputation is protected at all costs. I was now the wife of a respected man. A man praised for his business skill, his foreign education, his polished accent that impressed even my father. Outsiders believed I'd entered paradise, but I learned quickly that paradise has shadows, and some shadows are darker than any desert night. Not long after the wedding, I wandered my new home. It was beautiful, yes, but silent, too silent. It felt like a museum where nothing was supposed to move freely. I passed marble staircases, Persian carpets, portraits of ancestors I'd never met. Then I found a door, slightly open. I shouldn't have looked. But sometimes curiosity is the only rebellion left to a caged soul. Inside was a library. That alone was surprising. Even wealthy homes often had just a few decorative books. But this room was lined floor to ceiling with them. Arabic, English, French, history, poetry, science, law. I was stunned. I hadn't known Karim read anything besides contracts and newspapers. But what struck me wasn't the books. It was the smell. Sour, sharp, like old perfume mixed with fear. Then I saw the box, wooden, locked, tucked under a desk. My hands shook as I opened the drawer and found the key. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all handwritten in a woman's script. Some were torn. Others were stained with what looked like tears. They were all addressed to Karim. Please, let me see my son. You promised me protection. They'll kill me if you don't help. I still have the bruises. My heart pounded. These weren't love notes, they were pleas. Cries for help from a woman I didn't know, but who clearly knew my husband very well. Then I found a small photograph. A woman with hollow cheeks, big eyes, and a bruise half covered with makeup. She was holding a little boy, maybe 4 years old. Neither was smiling. My stomach twisted. I locked the box and put everything back exactly as I found it. I tried to forget, but I couldn't. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The next morning, I waited until breakfast. I let the coffee be poured, let the servants leave the room. Then I asked, as calmly as I could manage, "Who was the woman whose letters are in your library?" He didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, as if trying to measure how much I had seen, how much I had read. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat as stone. "You went into my private room." I stayed silent. His voice dropped even lower. "Don't ever go in there again." That was it. No explanation, no lies, no truths, just an order. I had stepped out of my cage, and he had snapped the lock shut again. But I couldn't unsee what I'd found. Those letters, the bruises, the child. After that, I watched Kareem differently. Not as a husband, but as a man with layers I hadn't even begun to understand. What else was he hiding? It was around that time I noticed the other women. They weren't family, not guests. They arrived quietly when he thought I was asleep or out. Some stayed an hour, others an entire day. They never met my gaze. One wore a black veil that covered everything but her shaking hands as she clutched her purse. When I asked Kareem who they were, he said simply, "Employees, legal issues." But I knew they were victims of men like him. Or maybe of him himself. Silence can be deafening. The absence of answers can scream. I pieced it together not from what I heard, but from what I didn't. The way servants avoided my questions. The way the driver refused to meet my eyes. The tightness in Kareem's jaw when I lingered near certain rooms. He had secrets, dark, dangerous ones. And whether I wanted to or not, I was part of them now. One night, I overheard a phone call. Kareem was in his office speaking in a low voice. I pressed my ear to the door, my heart racing. "She's asking too many questions," he said. Pause. "No, she doesn't know about her. Not yet." Pause. "If she finds out, I'll send her away. Like the others. Like the others." My blood froze. I wasn't a wife. I was a placeholder. An ornament that would be thrown away once it no longer suited him. That's when I realized this wasn't just a miserable marriage. It was a trap. And the palace I lived in wasn't just a cage. It was a crypt of buried lives, and I refused to be the next one buried. But escaping required a plan. I needed allies, hidden ones, and above all, I had to remember who I'd been before they renamed me wife. In a world where girls are taught silence before they can walk, listening becomes a weapon. I began to master it. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to in order to survive. Every whisper, every sideways glance, every locked door became a clue. That's when I began to notice her. She was always in black, always covered head to toe, always silent. She served tea, arranged flowers, swept floors, never once raising her eyes. But there was something about how she lingered near me, too purposeful to be an accident. One morning, I slipped a tiny note under the cushion of my reading chair. 4 words scribbled in Arabic. "Do you remember pain?" The next day it was gone. In its place was another note. Delicate handwriting. Every day. That was the start of a bond born in the shadows. Her name was Amal, or at least, that's what she let me call her. She was older than me, but not by much. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a breath. She'd been in the palace for years. "Inherited," she said once with bitter calm, like furniture, from Kareem's first wife. The woman whose letters I had found. "She's not dead," Amal told me one night as we sat in the dim servants' quarters. "But she might as well be. He sent her away. Far away. No one even says her name." "And the child?" I asked. Amal looked away. "He stayed." My breath caught. Kareem had a son, a hidden child, a secret buried like a stain beneath the rug of respectability, and I had married into that lie. "Why didn't she fight?" I whispered. "She did," Amal said softly. "But here, when a woman fights, she bleeds. And when she bleeds, she vanishes." That night I wept, not only for myself, but for the woman who had come before me. For Amal. For all the others who had simply disappeared without a trace. I understood then that I wasn't the first to wander these hallways with broken dreams. I was just the latest. The weeks that followed blurred into a delicate dance of obedience and quiet rebellion. I smiled when expected, dressed in silk and gold, sat at Karim's side during dinners like a statue carved from marble. But in secret, I met with Amal. She began teaching me how to move unseen, how to read the guards' glances, how to decipher the unspoken signals among the staff. It was like learning a forbidden language, the language of survival. One day, Amal handed me a folded piece of paper. On it was a layout of the entire house, rooms I'd never entered, hidden chambers I hadn't known existed. One spot was marked in red ink with a single word, cellar. It was the room beneath all rooms, not shown to visitors, not cleaned by staff. According to Amal, that was where Karim's first wife had last been seen before she vanished. I waited until Karim left on one of his rare business trips. He almost never trusted me alone in his house. But business seemed more important than suspicion. That night, guided by Amal, I crept from my room along the narrow servants' passageway to the locked cellar door. Amal had already secured the key. We descended into darkness. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of mold and secrets. We had only a weak kitchen flashlight to guide us, and then we saw it. A small room, a filthy mattress on the floor, a rusted sink, a cracked mirror hanging askew. On the wall, words had been scratched in Arabic with something sharp. I told the truth, and they caged me. The mattress still had old bloodstains. Amal squeezed my arm. This is where he kept her, for months. Why, I managed to ask, though I already knew. She disobeyed, Amal whispered. She tried to tell the world. That was the moment I broke. Not from fear, but from rage. How many more had been trapped here? How many daughters of this country had been silenced, hidden away, punished for the crime of having a voice? I returned to my room with a single burning plan. I would not be the next woman buried in whispers. I would record everything, not for revenge, but so the truth could survive. Even if I disappeared too, I wrote at night in secret. I used code names, metaphors only another woman from my world could understand. I chose a pseudonym, Sultana, not because I felt royal, but because I needed armor, a title to shield the terrified girl underneath. Through writing, I could breathe. I screamed onto paper. I cried between the lines. I told of the girl forced to marry, of the man who hoarded secrets like poison, of the women erased, of the servant who became my only light in the dark. The more I wrote, the more alive I felt. But the more I knew, the more dangerous it became. Karim returned 3 days later. The instant he walked in, I felt it. His smile was thinner, his eyes sharper. "Did you miss me?" he asked, cupping my chin. I forced a smile, of course. Inside, I was screaming, because behind him I saw it. A torn piece of paper sticking out of his briefcase. One of my pages. One of my secrets. He had found it. Now everything was at risk. My plans. Amal. Even my own name. There's a moment, tiny, fleeting, that separates ignorance from knowledge. For me, that moment was seeing that scrap of paper. It was like having my soul exposed on a cutting board. I didn't know how much he had read. Whether he understood that Sultana was me, that the quiet, obedient wife was the same woman bleeding truth onto paper behind locked doors. He didn't mention it that first night. Instead, he watched me, every movement, every breath. His silence felt heavier than chains. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak in the hallway felt like an approaching executioner. Amal noticed my terror. But I couldn't tell her, not yet. If Karim knew about the writings, I had to protect her too. She had risked everything for me. She was more than a friend. She was my reflection in a world full of masks. The next morning, Karim announced it out of nowhere. "We're leaving the city. To the desert, he added lightly, as though suggesting a holiday. For privacy, you've seemed unsettled. I wanted to run, but I nodded, because even defiance had to wear a veil. He brought only one servant with us, not Amal. A man, silent, armed, unknown to me. We drove for hours, through scorching heat, past endless dunes until the city was just a fading mirage behind us. The desert villa was beautiful, but it was a prison disguised as paradise. High walls, no cell signal, no neighbors, just sand and silence. The first night in the desert villa, he said nothing at all, just watched me, always watching. The second night, he asked out of nowhere, "Do you read much?" I swallowed, nodded carefully. "Sometimes." "Do you write?" I forced a brittle laugh. "Why would I write? I have nothing to say." He smiled slowly, coldly. "Everyone has something to say. The wise ones remain silent." That was when I knew he'd read the page. He didn't need to admit it. It was there in his voice, in the way his eyes measured every flicker of fear, in the way he kept tapping his watch, as though timing my reactions. On the third day, he led me up to the rooftop. The sun was setting in long orange streaks across the desert, the shadows growing deeper. He stood behind me as I stared at the empty horizon. "Do you believe in punishment?" he asked softly. I turned, my heart pounding. "Why are you asking me this?" "Because punishment," he said, voice low and sure, "is the only thing that maintains order in a chaotic world." Then he handed me a piece of paper. It wasn't the page he'd taken from my room before. It was new, my most recent, the one I'd hidden in the lining of my suitcase before we left the city. I'd thought it was safe. He had searched everything. He had been watching me far longer than I realized. "Who is she?" he asked calmly. "Referring to Sultana." I stared at the page, then at him. "She's no one." He didn't blink. "She's you." I stayed silent. Kareem took a deep breath. "I could end you right now. Out here. No one would ask any questions." For a moment, a flicker of hope lit in my chest that he might let me go. But it died instantly. "But I won't," he added, his voice softening in the worst way. "Pain is much more effective when it lasts." From that night on, I was no longer allowed to sleep in the bedroom. He locked me in a small adjoining room. No windows, a security camera in the corner, food shoved under the door twice a day. No pen, no paper, no voice. But my thoughts refused to be quiet. Even caged, my mind stayed free. I began to carve into the wooden floor. First, with my nails, then with a broken shard of porcelain from the sink. 1 word a day. Each letter a wound, but also a weapon. I carved stories, warnings, names. I carved the truth. One night, I carved Amal's name. I don't know why. Guilt, maybe. Longing. Or fear that I would never see her again. 2 days later, everything changed. The door opened, but it wasn't Kareem standing there. It was Amal, her face streaked with dirt, breathing hard, eyes wide with terror. "We don't have time," she hissed. "He's in Riyadh. He thinks you're broken." She had bribed a guard, risked everything. "We'll go through the back," she whispered. "There's a car." It's now or never. I didn't hesitate. I followed her. We ran, through blistering heat, past walls and guard towers, past the ghosts of women who had never made it out. We made it. For now. I'm writing this from a safe house, somewhere without a name, somewhere he can't find me. Yet, Amal is here too, alive, still whispering truths in a world that despises women who speak them. But I know it isn't over. He will come. For me. For Amal. For this story I've begun to tell. But this time I'm not silent. And I'm not alone. I am Sultana. And my words are no longer hidden. Their weapons, their freedom. They're just the beginning. My real name isn't Sultana, and I'll never share it. Because in my homeland, truth is treason. Women who speak it aren't buried under earth. They're buried under silence. If I gave you my real name, I'd vanish before you could even finish reading it. My children's futures would be erased. My friends imprisoned. My voice scrubbed from every record, every memory. So I am Sultana, not because that's who I am, but because it's who I must become to stay free. After our escape, Amal and I navigated the back roads of the desert, under false names and false papers, clinging to the hope that our real selves might one day breathe freely again. It took months to reach any semblance of safety. Every mile was a negotiation with fate. Every checkpoint was a gamble with life and death. We lived in the shadows, but we refused to live in silence. I wrote every single day, on napkins stolen from cafes, on scraps of fabric, on the backs of cigarette cartons. Whenever she could, Amal managed to smuggle me proper notebooks. I poured my truth onto them, as though knowing the pages might outlive me. I wrote about Kareem, about my father's iron grip, about the sister buried not in the ground, but in the lies of our family, about the servant girl who was executed for a crime she didn't commit, about the doctor who was silenced for telling a woman she had a choice, and about the women. So many women, too many to name. Women who looked like me, but were never allowed to be me. Women whose worth was measured only by obedience. Women taught to scream without making a sound. Some born in palaces, others in poverty. All raised behind invisible bars. All taught that love meant submission. That dignity was a privilege, not a right. That their bodies were property. That their silence was as valuable as gold. But I remembered every name, every face, every whispered secret shared in dark hallways, behind locked doors, under suffocating veils. I wrote it all down. And eventually, I found someone willing to help me tell the world. Her name was Jean Sasson. She wasn't Arab. She didn't wear a veil. But she listened. She believed me. She didn't treat my story as entertainment, but as a responsibility. She helped me shape it, word by word, into something dangerous, precisely because it was honest. We worked together in absolute secrecy, phone calls masked as interviews on unrelated topics, emails sent under code names, documents shared through hidden channels across borders and oceans. It was exhausting, terrifying, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't drowning in my own voice. When the book was finally published, I didn't know what to feel. Relief, pride, fear, all of them at once. I was still in hiding when I held the first copy in my hands. Princess, a true story of life behind the veil in Saudi Arabia. It read on the cover, but what I saw wasn't the title. I saw a mirror. I saw validation. I saw justice, late but real. The book made waves. Some praised it. Others condemned it. Many doubted it. That was expected. Truth stripped of its finery is always hard to believe, especially when it comes from a woman, especially in my world. But the most important thing happened quietly. Letters began to arrive. Encrypted emails, anonymous messages. Notes slipped from hand to hand, from women who recognized themselves in my story. Women who whispered, "I thought I was alone." Women who found courage they didn't know they had. Some ran, some stayed, but none of them stayed silent. That was the moment I realized I had become dangerous. Not because I held power, but because I gave it away. In words, in truth, in proof that even one woman without a name could shake the walls of a palace. Kareem tried to find me, twice. The second time he got close, too close. I had to leave the entire region for good. Amal chose to stay behind. That was her choice. She runs a quiet business now, She teaches English to girls who aren't supposed to dream of anything beyond marriage. She smiles more these days. She has secrets of her own. I know better than to ask. As for me, I live far from my homeland, and I miss it every single day. The smell of cardamom in my mother's kitchen, the call to prayer at dusk, my sister's laughter before they were broken, the desert wind that once seemed to whisper freedom, even as the walls closed in. But I don't miss the cage. I don't miss the silence. And I don't regret telling my story. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever go back. Maybe when my daughters are old enough to choose for themselves. Maybe when the men who fear women's voices no longer hold power. Maybe when girls can grow up as people, not property. Until then I will write. And when I cannot write, I will speak. And when I cannot speak, I will be the echo behind every woman still hiding her truth behind a locked door. My real name isn't Sultana, but this story is real, and so am I. And now, so are you, because by reading this, you've joined me in breaking the silence. And once silence is broken, it can never truly return.